I remember that morning with a sort of clarity that only arrives years later, when the noise of daily life has thinned enough for certain details to drift back through the cracks. Oxford had settled itself into one of those pale, reluctant dawns that seemed to rise not from the horizon but from some hidden crevice of stone. I found myself sitting in a modest cafe off the high street, one of those places where the windows always held a faint mist, as if reluctant to let the world inside. The tea was too sweet, though I had not asked for sugar, and the taste lingered with a faint irritation I was too tired to voice. I had taken with me the morning newspaper, folded so many times that its creases refused to behave. Somewhere near the middle pages, a small article sat in unassuming print, the kind of thing a reader might miss unless searching for the quiet tragedies that never make headlines. Warwick College Library was opening an exhibition on medieval manuscripts, and tucked at the end of the announcement was a line about the unexpected death of a librarian. Henry Staveley, 59. Collapsed sometime past midnight, cause uncertain but likely the heart's mutiny. The words felt thin, as though pared down to spare anyone the discomfort of feeling too much. I read the sentence twice, then once more, without any particular reason at the time. Something in it stuck like a burr in the mind, not the fact of death, but the way it had been written. Too brief, too neat. I let the paper fall against the table and watched the steam from my cup rise in small curls, losing its shape almost immediately. At the next table, a pair of students whispered over a pile of notes. Their voices drifted in and out of hearing, more cadence than content, until one of them said, with a strange mixture of amusement and unease, that nothing in those old pages is what it seems. I should have ignored it. People say such things all the time around here, intoxicated by the romance of parchment and ink, but the line hangs in the air with an odd weight. Perhaps it was the way she paused afterward, as though the sentence had unsettled even her. I took out the crossword from the back of the paper, a habit as unconscious as breathing. One of the clue's 7 letters, something about truth concealed, felt too pointed for coincidence. I left it blank. There are moments when even the mind avoids solving what it isn't ready to name. Outside, the sky had shifted into a deeper gray, the kind that presses lightly upon the buildings, muting even the crisp echo of passing bicycles. I stepped out, the cold meeting me with a familiar indifference. The stones beneath my feet gleamed faintly from an earlier drizzle, and the air tasted of rain that had not yet made its final decision. I remember walking without aim, letting my steps guide me past Radcliffe Square, where the dome wore its usual expression of eternally mild surprise. There are days when the city seems to breathe with you, and days when it insists on exhaling in its own rhythm, leaving you to catch up. That morning belonged to the latter. Somewhere along the route I paused beneath a narrow archway. A memory tugged at me, not of a case, but of a night years earlier when I'd stood in almost the same spot, listening to distant bells and wondering whether I had wasted too many chances at something resembling companionship. The thought passed quickly, carried off by a gust of wind that rattled an old poster against a college gate. It should have been an ordinary day. A librarian's death should have been just that, a quiet end to a quiet life. But even then, without any firm reason, I felt the slightest pressure at the back of my mind, as though some unseen thread had brushed against it. A sense that the story I'd read in the paper was not quite complete, that something waited beneath its surface, written not in printed words but in the silences between them. I continued walking, the city slowly waking at my side, and though I told myself I was merely passing the time, I knew I was already leaning toward Warwick College, drawn by an unease I could not yet articulate. Lewis drove us toward Warwick College with the kind of careful patience he reserved for mornings when my mood had not yet declared its intentions. The city eased past in subdued colors, as though Oxford itself felt compelled to lower its voice. A thin film of rain clung to the windscreen, blurring the outlines of spires and chimneys into gentle smudges. I found myself watching the droplets trace hesitant paths downward, merging, separating, behaving with more purpose than most people I'd met that week. Lewis filled the silence with small observations about the weather and the likelihood that Staveley's death would prove as undramatic as the newspaper suggested. I let his words settle without response. There are mornings when conversation is simply another weight to carry, and I was already thinking about the librarian whose life had vanished between one heartbeat and the next. Something in the phrasing of that article had refused to lie flat. Warwick College came into view with its usual restraint. A modest quadrangle, narrow corridors, an architecture that preferred to be overlooked. Yet the air felt stiffened, as if the stone itself were holding something close. A porter greeted us with that blend of duty and unease common to people who have spent the night repeating the same story. His voice drifted into the courtyard where the rain gathered in small, persistent circles. He told us Staveley had been found near the archive room, alone, his glasses beside him on the floor. No sign of struggle, nothing missing, nothing dramatic, nothing helpful. Inside, the building released the faint odor of old paper and polished wood. I've always found such scents oddly comforting, though on that morning they seemed to carry a trace of sorrow that clung stubbornly to the air. The floorboards creaked. Beneath us, as Lewis and I followed the archivist. She introduced herself with a clipped tone, barely concealing irritation that death had forced its way into her schedule. She spoke of Staveley as a competent colleague, diligent enough, though perhaps rather too absorbed in marginalia for his own good. I sensed the impatience tucked neatly behind her words. People reveal more in what they do not express. She led us to Staveley's small office. Papers lay stacked with near-obsessive precision, except for a single visitor's pass placed askew on the desk. I brushed a finger lightly across it. The date was recent. The name is illegible. The porter had not mentioned any visitor. I asked her about it quietly. She shrugged it off, insisting that guests came and went, often without leaving much trace. But I saw a momentary tightening in her expression, as brief as a breath, and filed it away. The mind remembers these things even when it pretends otherwise. On the wall hung the brochure for the manuscript exhibition Staveley had been preparing. I noticed a Latin phrase printed beneath an illustration. Its translation was confidently wrong, an error deliberate enough to make me wonder whether Staveley had meant to correct it. I made a note in the small pad I kept tucked in my coat, though I doubted Lewis noticed. He had turned his attention to the shelves where Staveley had indexed Centuries of Dust with almost devotional care. We continued down the corridor toward the archive room. The scent of tobacco lingered faintly, though the college prohibited smoking anywhere inside the building. I paused, letting the air settle in my lungs long enough to be certain. Lewis glanced at me, puzzled, but said nothing. I wanted to tell him that the smell was fresh enough to belong to someone who had stood there not long before, but the words felt premature, like a deduction still searching for its footing. As we stepped into the archive room, a hush settled around us. The dim light, the heavy bindings, the quiet authority of ancient paper, all of it felt like a world Staveley had lived in far more comfortably than the one outside. I tried to imagine him here on his final night, bent over some fragile page, unaware of how swiftly life unravels. I felt then, with a faint and inexplicable certainty, that the neatness of his death concealed something jagged beneath it. Not a crime, necessarily. Not yet. Simply an untidiness of truth waiting for the right angle of light. And as we left the room, I could not shake the sense that someone had been waiting there recently, listening to footsteps in the corridor, hoping not to be seen. The Warwick Manuscript lay beneath a pane of tempered glass, displayed with the kind of reverence usually reserved for relics of saints or poets who died too young. I stood before it longer than I intended, watching the faint gleam of the library's overhead lamps gather on its surface. The pages themselves were a muted yellow, softened by centuries of careful handling. Marginalia drifted around the text like the ghost traces of long-dead scholars, their thoughts etched in strokes that seemed at once tentative and urgent. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the haifash that arrives whenever I realize I'm looking at something older and perhaps wiser than I will ever be. Lewis waited beside me with the patient resignation of a man who knew this ritual well. He murmured something about the archivist expecting us upstairs. I nodded, but did not immediately move. There is a stillness one must inhabit before speaking to people who have spent their lives in the company of old paper, a kind of quiet that lets the mind slip into the rhythm of ink laid down by trembling hands. What drew my eye was not the illuminated capitals or the worn thread along the spine, but a narrow strip of writing tucked into the bottom margin of the 13th page. The script differed subtly from its neighbors, as if the hand had been steadier, or perhaps younger. A cipher, the archivist had said earlier, though she dismissed it with the impatience of someone who disliked puzzles she hadn't solved herself. A poetic riddle, she'd called it, the sort that medieval scribes added for amusement, like children slipping secrets into their school books. But as I leaned closer, I sensed a tension in the strokes, a reluctance, even fear. People rarely write with fear unless truth presses too hard against the ribs. The graduate student assigned to assist us hovered behind my shoulder. He had the polite nervousness of someone who believed the world had overlooked his brilliance. His voice, when he spoke, carried the faint tremor of someone who desperately wished to be relevant. He told me Staveley had been studying that very margin hours before he died, that he had been unusually protective of the manuscript, refusing to let anyone handle it the week before his collapse. I asked him quietly whether Staveley had mentioned anything specific. He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Then he said Staveley had received an anonymous letter warning, he called it, telling him to leave the cipher alone. The student claimed Staveley found the letter amusing, but the tightness around his eyes suggested he doubted his own story. He handed me an envelope, worn at the edges. I slipped it open, the paper exhaling a faint mustiness. The message inside contained only a single line, written in slanted strokes that leaned forward as if they were being pushed by a strong wind. It said simply, "Let the dead speak for themselves." Something about the phrasing felt deliberately archaic, like an imitation of a voice that no longer existed. But when I held the paper up to the light, I saw faint indentations running diagonally across its marks, left by some forgotten hand writing on the page above. A ghost writing of a ghost writing. I traced the grooves with my fingertip, feeling the unevenness, the pressure of a pen, hesitating mid-stroke. A second message waiting beneath the first. Something hidden, or perhaps something erased too hastily. Lewis, meanwhile, wandered toward the exhibition cases with mild curiosity. He commented on the illustrations, dragons coiled around borders, saints with sorrowful eyes. His voice softened as he spoke, the library's hush settling on him like a borrowed coat. I found myself envying his ease. The past rarely speaks gently to those who spend too much time listening. The archivist rejoined us, her footsteps brisk and disapproving. She lectured us on humidity levels and the dangers of prolonged inspection, though I sensed she wanted nothing more than to end our visit. I asked her, just before she turned away, whether she knew of the anonymous letter. Her pause was nearly imperceptible, but I caught the smallest fracture in composure, quickly sealed. She answered with a coolness that didn't quite mask the tremor beneath. When she left, I looked again at the margined cipher. Something in its curves hinted at a pattern, a rhythm not yet clear, a whisper that refused to settle into silence. And as we stepped out of the archive, the rain began once more, tapping softly against the leaded windows as though trying to speak in a language only the dead and a few stubborn librarians still understood. Warwick's cloisters have always struck me as places where silence chooses its own depth. Some mornings they merely hush the footsteps, on others they seem to swallow whole conversations. That afternoon, walking beneath their archways with Lewis at my side, I felt the stillness press in a little too closely, as though the stone itself was listening to our thoughts with cool indifference. I told myself it was only the weather settling into its grey refusal to brighten, but the mind rarely accepts such simple excuses. We began with the archivist, who met us beneath a narrow window that admitted a sliver of pale light. She spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone who had been answering questions all morning, though none of them to her satisfaction. Her words drifted into the cloister air with a restrained impatience. She insisted she had seen Staveley only briefly the previous evening, that he had appeared somewhat distracted, that he had been muttering about misplaced documents, but nothing alarming. Yet there was a small, deliberate pause whenever she mentioned his name, as if she were choosing each syllable with too much care. I watched the way her hand tightened around the folder she carried, the knuckles paling slightly. People reveal more in the tension they hide than in the stories they tell. The graduate student arrived next, summoned by a porter who seemed glad to avoid further involvement. The young man carried his nervousness like a second coat, heavy and ill-fitting. He spoke of Staveley's brilliance, though there was a faint resentment tucked into the corners of his praise. When I asked whether he had ever worked on the manuscript himself, he hesitated just long enough for the truth to slip through. He had been denied access recently, an exclusion he attributed to Staveley's increasing paranoia. As he spoke, I noticed a spot of ink on his cuff, a detail too ordinary to matter, yet it lingered in my mind. I could not help imagining him hunched over some late-night scribbling, desperate to crack the cipher before anyone else. The bursar joined us after a short delay, walking with the quickened pace of a man accustomed to chasing budgets rather than mysteries. He offered his condolences with dry professionalism and spoke at length about the financial strains of maintaining archives few students cared about. His voice carried no malice, only exasperation, yet when I mentioned the anonymous letter, his eyes flickered, not with fear, but recognition quickly smothered. Lewis missed it. I didn't. Such flickers often mark the edge of a secret someone hopes will remain undisturbed. It was the lecturer, however, who held my attention most stubbornly. He was charming in a way that felt practiced, the kind of charm that emerges from years of offering answers before questions have even been asked. His smile came easily, though his gaze avoided mine whenever I steered the conversation toward the manuscript. He insisted he had barely known Staveley, that their paths crossed only in professional courtesies. Yet while he spoke, he absent-mindedly quoted Tennyson incorrectly. A small misstep, but one that struck me as curious. Scholars rarely misquote poets they admire, unless their minds are occupied elsewhere, tugged by something they would rather conceal. Lewis recorded their statements diligently, unaware of the quiet threads beginning to coil around us. I listened not to their words, but to the spaces between them. The archivist's too careful composure, the student's restless envy, the bursar's unguarded flicker, the lecturer's polished evasions, each offered a shape of truth, but none of them fit together with the ease of honest recollection. As we walked back through the cloister, the air had thickened into a cool dampness. The rain outside tapped faintly against the stone, a soft percussion that felt almost purposeful. I found myself thinking of the visitor's pass resting in Staveley's office, the one with the name blurred beyond recognition. The archivist had dismissed it too quickly. People in grief tend to linger, but she moved through her explanations as though race-walking past uncomfortable memories. Lewis asked whether I had formed any impressions. I told him the cloisters always make me suspicious they hide too much behind their echoes. What I didn't tell him was that each of the four had offered a contradiction small enough to overlook, but sharp enough to draw blood if pressed. The truth, if it existed anywhere near us, was hiding like a shy pupil behind the folds of their stories. and as we stepped out into the rain-darkened quadrangle, I felt again that faint, stirring detail, half-formed, brushing against the edges of thought, waiting for its moment to speak. I've often thought that the first false solution in any investigation arrives not from the facts themselves, but from the quiet longing for something that fits. Human beings, myself included, are too eager for patterns, too ready to accept an arrangement of pieces that forms a shape resembling truth, even if only at a distance. That afternoon at Warwick, I found myself drifting into precisely that temptation. Lewis and I had returned to Staveley's office, the corridor emptier than it had been in the morning. The soft hum of some unseen radiator settled into the silence like a low, tired breath. The scent of floor polish lingered, faint but insistent, blending with the mustiness that seems to cling to all old college rooms, as though past occupants were reluctant to leave. On the desk lay the same neat stacks of papers, the same misplaced visitor's pass, the same unassuming quiet that now felt staged. Lewis observed that the graduate student looked the likeliest candidate so far. His eagerness, his resentment, his proximity to Staveley's work, one did not need a detective's mind to entertain the thought. I told him such things bore consideration, though my voice lacked conviction. Still, the idea had begun its slow creep through the corridors of my mind. The letter, after all, had come from someone with a shaky but youthful hand. The student fit the shape, if one looked at it from the right angle. As I sifted through the desk drawers, a faint rustle caught my ear, the kind of sound paper makes when disturbed by the memory of a previous touch. I found a collection of notes scrawled in Staveley's uneven script. They were observations about the manuscript, references to scholars long gone, and lines that hinted at something he had not yet dared to name. Tucked among them was a small scrap of crossword paper, torn along its edge. Only one clue was visible. 7 down, truth concealed beneath false shadow. Yet the answer space was blank. I stared at the clue for a long moment, hearing again the student's claim that Staveley had grown paranoid. Perhaps the poor man had, after all, imagined threats where none existed. The anonymous letter might have been a joke gone wrong, a petty attempt to frighten someone too engrossed in his work. If the student had indeed written it, he might have meant only to unsettle Staveley, not harm him. But people seldom foresee the consequences of their small cruelties. Lewis found an empty cigarette packet beneath a stack of old catalogues. He held it up with a faint triumph of discovery. The student didn't smoke, he reminded me. The archivist detested the habit. The lecturer preferred cigars, which left a different scent entirely. Only the bursar was known to smoke occasionally, though discreetly enough that few ever caught him at it. The packet, then, nudged the suspicion in a different direction, yet the scent lingering in the corridor had been fresh, sharper, unmistakably from a stronger brand. I felt the narrative threading itself together, too neatly. A jealous student, denied access to the manuscript, sends a menacing letter. He confronts Staveley, tempers flare, and in the heat of it all, the librarian collapses. Panic follows. The student hides the letter, stages the scene, slips away. It all had the superficial elegance of a simple moral parable. Ambition meets consequence. Yet simplicity has always been the most dangerous of disguises. Even as I allowed the theory to form, a faint unease tugged at me. There was something in the student's manner's hesitance, yes, but not the kind born of guilt. More the hesitation of someone who fears irrelevance. And the inkstain on his cuff had been blue, while the anonymous letter was written in black. We stepped out into the quadrangle, where the rain had thinned into a mist that softened the edges of everything it touched. Lewis asked whether I believed the student was capable of it. I told him that capability was rarely the deciding factor. People commit acts they never imagined themselves capable of when the right pressure is applied. But even as I spoke, The words tasted uncertain. I looked back at the library windows, faintly lit against the rising dusk. A misleading truth had taken shape, seductive in its clarity, yet something quieter resisted it within me. A single thread out of place, a detail that refused to settle, and though I couldn't yet name it, I felt it waiting, just beyond the reach of thought, breathing in the dark like an unspoken answer. The rain had begun its steady descent. By the time Lewis and I stepped out of the college gates, the kind of persistent drizzle Oxford seems to produce without effort or apology. It softened the outlines of the buildings, blurring them into a landscape that felt half-remembered rather than seen. Lewis offered to fetch the car, and I let him go without protest. There are moments when solitude feels less like a choice and more like a necessity, and that stretch of pavement outside Warwick held precisely that sort of moment. I stood beneath the overhang of an ancient stone arch, watching the rain fall in thin, silvery threads. The sound of it against the flagstones had a strangely measured rhythm, as though the weather were trying to speak in a language I'd once known but forgotten. My thoughts returned, uninvited, to the manuscript's cipher, to the student's nervous tremor, to the archivist's carefully arranged indifference. Each had offered a shape of meaning, but none had fit with the ease truth usually demands. It was then that I saw her. She stood across the narrow lane, half-sheltered beneath the drooping branches of an elm that had outlived generations of students. Her coat was damp enough to cling to her frame, and the hood had slipped back, allowing her hair dark, though not black, to gather rain, like a series of small, unspoken confessions. She did not look at me at first. Her gaze was fixed on the college windows, the ones glowing faintly with the dim light of afternoon lectures and unseen conversations. There was something about her stillness that drew my attention more sharply than any movement could have. People waiting in the rain usually wear their impatience openly. This woman carried hers with a quiet restraint that bordered on sorrow. I found myself walking toward her before I had decided to do so. When she finally looked at me, her expression carried the subtle exhaustion of someone who had spent too long hoping for an answer that refused to arrive. She asked whether I was involved in the business inside, though she didn't say Staveley's name. The question came out softly, as if she feared the weight it might carry if spoken too loudly. I told her I was making inquiries. She nodded, as though she had expected that. She spoke of knowing Staveley, but the phrasing was careful, almost protective. She said he had been a man who recognized fear in others because he carried too much of it himself. The rain ran along her jawline as she spoke, and I had the odd sensation that the weather was listening more intently than I could manage. I asked how recently she had seen him. She hesitated a small pause, easily missed. Then she said they had spoken a few weeks earlier, though the reluctance in her voice suggested a different truth. Her eyes drifted back to the windows, and she asked whether I believed he had died naturally. The way she asked it carried the faintest vibration of dread. I told her I believed very little with certainty at that stage. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile a person offers in self-defense, a thin shield against disappointment. The rain thickened, gathering into uneven drops that pattered onto the path between us. She pulled her coat tighter and said she had to leave, though I sensed she wanted to stay. Before she turned away, I asked her name. She told me, but the name felt like a fragment rather than the whole spoken too quickly, too cautiously, as if she were offering only part of herself. As she walked to a small, aging car parked beneath a row of wet sycamores, I noticed something more telling than her name. The number plate bore an older registration inconsistent with the model year, a minor discrepancy easily dismissed, yet the sort of detail that lingers in a mind accustomed to following thin threads. She drove off without looking back, her tail lights glowing briefly against the curtain of rain before disappearing around the corner. Lewis pulled up beside me a few moments later. He asked whether I had been speaking to anyone. I told him only that the rain brings out all sorts of ghosts in Oxford, some of them living, He laughed, but I barely heard him. My thoughts had already returned to the woman's pause, her caution, the tremor of truth that had almost surfaced. The rain continued, its quiet insistence, and I felt again that familiar stirring of faint intuition, like the first note of a melody not yet formed, waiting for the rest to follow. The night I returned to my flat after that long, rain-soaked day at Warwick, I found sleep waiting for me in the same evasive way the truth so often does, hovering at the edges, but refusing to settle. The lamplight cast a muted glow across the room, catching the dust motes drifting like reluctant constellations. On the small table beside my armchair lay Staveley's notebook, the one Lewis had retrieved from the archivist's office with that faint sense of triumph he saved for tangible evidence. I had every intention of ignoring it until morning, but intention and action rarely align when the mind has already begun its quiet descent into obsession. I opened the notebook reluctantly, as though disturbing a private grief. The pages were filled with Staveley's cramped handwriting observations, cross-references, and small exclamations of discovery written in the margins. Most of it resembled the usual academic detritus, the kind that scholars produce when they spend too long circling ideas that refuse to yield. But somewhere near the middle, I found a missing page. The torn edge stood out like a wound, the fibers rough and uneven. Someone had removed it quickly, not cleanly. What remained on the adjacent page, however, was curious enough to pull me deeper into the lamplight. A crossword clue written in Staveley's hands alone near the top, separated from the rest of his notes as though he had meant it to be seen. It read, 6 across the thing hidden that reveals. No answer followed. Beneath it, a strange alignment of letters and symbols formed a narrow column, as if Staveley had been testing the edges of some code he hadn't quite solved. I heard the rain tapping lightly against the window, the same uneven rhythm I had listened to outside Warwick's gates. The coded column seemed to pulse faintly in the lamplight, though I knew it was only my tired eyes playing tricks. I leaned back, letting the page rest on my knee, and closed my eyes. There is a point in every investigation when deduction becomes less a matter of intellect and more a matter of listening to the quiet murmurs beneath the noise, the thoughts that arrive between heartbeats. Lewis had gone home hours earlier, carrying with him a certainty that the case, such as it was, would loosen by morning. He had dismissed the missing page as an irrelevant oddity. People tear things out of notebooks all the time, he'd said, but the roughness of that tear lingered with me. Paper removed in haste often speaks with a sharper voice than paper untouched. I returned to the coded column. Letters repeated with disarming irregularity, some spaced widely apart, others running into each other like thoughts stumbling over themselves. It was not a language I recognized, though something about the pattern felt vaguely musical, as if it could, given the right lens, resolve into meaning. On the margin beside it, Staveley had drawn a small arrow pointing upward toward the edge of the missing page. A subtle suggestion that whatever had been written above had guided the code below, a key removed from its lock. The lamplight flickered for a moment, an old wiring fault I had neglected to address. In that brief stutter of illumination, the indentation on the opposite page caught my eye. Faint grooves, invisible unless the light struck them at precisely the right angle. Someone had written something on the missing page, pressing hard enough for the marks to bleed through, but the words themselves had been lifted away. I ran my fingertips across the shallow impressions, feeling the direction of the strokes, the rhythm of the hand. The script felt deliberate, not hurried. A knock sounded somewhere in the building's neighbor's door, perhaps, and the moment dissolved. I reached for a pencil, shading lightly across the indentation. The outline of a word began to appear, faint and incomplete, but present enough to send a quiet shiver through me. Not a name, not yet, but a fragment of one, a beginning. I sat back again, letting the pencil fall from my hand. The room felt smaller than it had an hour earlier, as though the walls had leaned in to listen. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, its pitch rising and falling with an eerie, lonely persistence. Staveley had been reaching for something in those last days, something he had feared or hoped, or perhaps both. In the missing page, whatever had been written on it, was no trivial note torn away in frustration. It was a message someone had not wanted to find. The following morning unfolded with a kind of muted reluctance, as though Oxford itself had grown weary of holding its silences. The pavements glistened from the night's rain, and the clouds continued their slow drift above the spires with the same indifference they've shown for centuries. Lewis and I made our way back to Warwick, neither of us speaking much. I carried Staveley's notebook in my coat pocket, its weight more psychological than physical. The indentation on the page had begun to form a name in my thoughts, though still incomplete, too faint for certainty, too suggestive for comfort. The college seemed brighter than it had the previous day, though brightness in Oxford always carries an undercurrent of hesitation, like a smile one isn't sure will be returned. Students moved through the quad with hurried steps, unaware or indifferent to the librarian's death. I envied them for the freedom of their untroubled concerns. Age steals that ease of investigation and buries it. The archivist met us with a tone that felt polished, almost too ready. She told us the lecturer had been seen entering the archive on the night Staveley died, contradicting his earlier claim that he had left the college long before dusk. The porter had remembered it suddenly. She said, as though recollection was something that arrived with the morning light. Even Lewis, whose trust in simple explanations was sturdier than mine, raised an eyebrow at the convenience of it. We found the lecturer in his office, surrounded by books arranged so neatly that the room felt staged. He greeted us with a practiced warmth that slipped in and out of sincerity. When I mentioned the archive, his gaze faltered for a heartbeat before recovering its composure. He said he had stopped by briefly to return a borrowed volume, nothing more. The tremor in his voice was subtle, but in a man who curated his charm so meticulously, even a minor crack felt significant. Lewis leaned on the edge of the desk, asking questions with the earnest directness he preferred. I remained standing, letting the lecturer's gestures reveal more than his answers. His hands, which had moved so fluidly when he spoke earlier of poetry, now fidgeted with the corner of a paperweight. He avoided mentioning Staveley unless prompted, and when he did, he used phrases stripped of emotion, perhaps to conceal the relief or guilt beneath. It was then I noticed the visitor's register resting beneath a stack of journals. One name had been crossed out with a careful stroke. Too careful. The kind of crossing out meant to look casual, but executed with the precision of someone overly aware of being observed. I asked the lecturer whether he had signed in that evening. He said he had forgotten, offering a small, apologetic laugh. Yet the crossed-out name ended with the same letter as his own surname, the faint, curved stroke lingering beneath the ink. A coincidence, perhaps. Coincidences appear frequently when the mind is primed to seek them. The archivist reappeared just as we left, her expression taut. She asked whether the lecturer had clarified matters. The eagerness behind the question betrayed her. People who want a solution quickly usually have strong feelings about whom they hope will be implicated. I sensed in her an anticipation that did not align with professional grief. The smell of tobacco lingered faintly on her coat, not fresh, but present enough to stir the questions I was still carrying. Back outside, Lewis was convinced we had reached the heart of it. The lecturer had lied. The register supported it. His hesitation, his evasions, his fragile charm, they formed a structure that resembled guilt. I could not fault Lewis for seeing it that way. The pieces fit neatly, almost elegantly. But neatness has always made me suspicious. I thought again of the coded column in Staveley's notebook, of the indentation forming a name, of the missing page violently torn away. none of it aligned with a lecturer who seemed more afraid of embarrassment than capable of malice. And that careful crossing out on the register, it felt too deliberate, almost placed there for us to find. Red herrings do not always swim toward us by chance. Sometimes they are thrown into the water with an expert's aim. As we walked across the quad, a breeze stirred the puddles into ripples. The sky had begun to brighten in that peculiar Oxford waylight, seeping through clouds without fully committing to the gesture. Lewis asked me whether the lecturer had become our primary suspect. I told him he had become the second version of a truth that might not exist. He laughed, assuming I was being philosophical. But the truth was far simpler. I'd begun to feel the wrongness again, that thin, persistent tremor beneath the facts. The lecturer's guilt fits too easily, and anything that fits too easily rarely belongs. A second red herring had drifted into our path, and yet the waters beneath remained stubbornly dark. I returned to my flat that evening with the kind of heaviness that settles not in the limbs, but somewhere quieter, somewhere thought tries to avoid. The lecturer's fragile deceptions, the archivist's brittle certainty, the student's restless envy, each had formed its own small constellation of suspicion, yet none illuminated the space where truth usually glimmers. I placed Staveley's notebook on the table, switched on the lamp, and stood there for a long moment, listening to the faint hum of the bulb as though it might steady the unease shifting through me. The indentation on the page had been haunting me all afternoon. A faint ghost trapped beneath the surface, waiting for someone stubborn or foolish enough to coax it upward. I retrieved the soft pencil I had used the night before. Its tip was worn to a blunt edge, which somehow felt appropriate for the task. Precision was less important than patience. I began shading again, slowly this time, letting the graphite spread in muted strokes across the paper. The grooves responded reluctantly, as though wary of revealing more than they wished. Bit by bit, a word emerged, not fully, but enough to suggest shape. A looped letter, then another. I leaned closer, holding my breath without meaning to. The lines gathered themselves with a faint dignity, forming a name I'd heard only once, spoken quietly beneath an elm tree by a woman who seemed afraid of her own voice. The indentation was hers. She had written something on the torn page, something Staveley had kept, or perhaps something she had taken back in haste. The realization drew a faint shiver along my spine, a small but undeniable recognition that I had been walking beside a truth without noticing it. She had told me she knew Staveley, but her face, her hesitation, her careful caution, they hinted at something deeper, something more entangled. I set the pencil down and let the moment breathe. Rain began tapping gently against the window, tentative at first, then more insistent. The sound folded itself into my thoughts, and I found myself replaying our brief conversation, her gaze lingering on the college windows, the way she spoke of fear, with the softness of someone who had lived too long with the haste in her departure, as though she feared being seen. Lewis called around 9:30. His voice carried a weariness that matched my own. He asked whether I had made progress. I told him I was working through a detail. He chuckled, saying Staveley had probably scribbled half of it in code just to keep his own mind amused. But when I asked whether he remembered the woman from earlier, the one in the rain's tone shifted. He had barely noticed her at all. That somehow unsettled me more than her presence had. People who remain half invisible often have reasons for it. After the call ended, I reopened the notebook, letting the lamplight settle across the page like a muted confession. On the lower margin, beside the coded column, Staveley had drawn a small, wavering line, almost an arrow, almost a gesture of doubt. It pointed not to the missing page, but to the indentation itself, as if he had known someone would need to see what had vanished. I considered the possibility that she had confronted him, perhaps gently at first, then with urgency. A daughter, maybe, though she had never claimed that. A former student, someone wounded by him, or someone he had harmed by omission. The shape of their connection remained blurred, but the emotional gravity around her, name half formed as it was, felt unmistakable. Truth, in investigations and in life, often hides not in the facts, but in the tremors between them. The notebook's spine creaked softly as I closed it, the sound strangely intimate in the quiet room. Outside, the rain deepened, washing over the pavements with a steady rhythm that reminded me of footsteps, hesitant, returning, departing again. I stood at the window for a long while, watching the streetlights smear their glow across the wet asphalt. I realized then, with an unsettling clarity, that I no longer believed she had merely known Staveley. Her name, hidden, erased, yet lingering, was the ghost rising through the paper, and she had been far closer to the heart of his final days than she had ever allowed herself to say. Some cases reveal themselves all at once, like a curtain yanked back from a window. Others, in my experience, drop their truths slowly, as if reluctant to admit what they already know. That morning, walking once more through Warwick's narrow lanes, I felt the past pressing in on me with a quiet insistence. The woman's name, half-formed in graphite, lingering beneath Staveley's missing page, had begun shaping itself in my mind with a clarity I could no longer ignore. Lewis joined me outside the library steps, his breath forming small clouds in the early chill. He asked why I seemed unsettled, though he phrased it more politely. I told him only that some ghosts arrive before we're prepared to face them. He gave me a puzzled look, but his good sense kept him from asking more. There are days when his restraint feels like a grace I do not deserve. We found the archivist adjusting the display lights in the exhibition hall, movements clipped and too precise. Her coat hung neatly over a nearby chair, yet I could still detect the faint scent of tobacco that had clung to it 2 days earlier. She must have seen the direction of my gaze, for she mentioned, almost defensively, that the bursar had recently borrowed her office for meetings. I made a small sound in acknowledgement, though the explanation settled uneasily. She informed us that someone, early that morning, had attempted to access Staveley's office without authorization. A shadow in the corridor, she said, could have been a student, could have been anyone. But the tremor in her voice betrayed more than uncertainty. I watched her fingers tighten around the keyring she held, the metal pressing crescents into her skin. Fear does not always announce itself. Sometimes it slips in quietly through the smallest gestures. Lewis went off to speak with the bursar, leaving me alone in the exhibition hall. The Warwick Manuscript rested beneath its glass, patient and inscrutable. I traced my gaze along the 13th page, at the cipher that had stirred such unease in Staveley's final days. Beneath the neat strokes of medieval ink, I imagined the coded column in his notebook, the strange musical arrangement of letters pointing toward something he had only begun to decipher. The woman knew it too. Her silence that day in the rain now felt charged with an old, heavy sorrow. Staveley's hesitation, the missing page, the faint ghost of her name threads that had once seemed separate now tugged at one another with a coherence I could no longer wave aside. When I stepped into the corridor, I found her waiting for me. She stood with the same quiet composure I remembered, her hands clasped loosely, her coat still damp, though the sky outside had been dry for hours. She told me she should not have come back. The words settled into the corridor with the weight of confession. I asked her why she had returned. She said she needed to know what had been found in the notebook, whether the indentation had revealed anything. Her voice, steady at first, thinned slightly on the last word. I told her it had revealed more than she might have intended. She closed her eyes briefly, a gesture not of fear, but of resignation. When she spoke again, she admitted she had confronted Staveley that night after years of estrangement, years spent trying to bury the part of her that belonged to him. She said he had looked at her with something approaching relief, not dread. That they had spoken in halting fragments, like strangers reciting half-familiar lines from a forgotten play. But she insisted she had left him alive. It was the certainty in her voice that unsettled me most. Not defensive, not evasive. simply the kind of certainty a person carries when they have rehearsed their truth through long nights of regret. I asked her whether she believed someone followed her out. She hesitated, then nodded. "A sound in the corridor," she said. Footsteps that slowed when she turned. A shadow that paused just long enough to make her quicken her pace. The past breaks the present, not with revelations, but with echoes. Lewis returned with the bursar in tow, both of them mid-conversation. The woman stiffened. The bursar glanced at her, a flicker of recognition crossing his features quickly suppressed. I stored that reaction carefully, like a fragile specimen. She murmured that she had said all she could. Then she slipped away down the corridor, her footsteps barely audible against the ancient wood. Lewis asked what she wanted. I told him she carried decades of unfinished business. What I did not tell him, what I barely dared to admit to myself, was that the shadow she'd felt that night might still be following her, and that the truth she had finally begun to reveal had only deepened the darkness around us. I returned to Warwick later that evening with the sort of weary determination that arrives only when one realizes the truth has grown tired of being ignored. The sky had sunk into a muted blue. The last remnants of daylight stretched thin across the rooftops like a memory reluctant to leave. Lewis had offered to accompany me, but I told him I needed a few hours alone with the manuscript, and he accepted this with the resigned patience of someone who had learned long ago that certain tasks must be endured rather than understood. The archive was empty when I entered, save for the slow creak of the heavy door behind me. The air held that familiar scent dust softened by time, leather bindings, and the faint whisper of old ink. It felt almost ecclesiastical, as though each volume stored its own confession. I switched on the small reading lamp above the manuscript's display case, its circle of light settling over the pages like a benediction. I opened Staveley's notebook to the coded column, letting my eyes travel again over the uneven sequence of letters. It felt less chaotic tonight, as though the intervening hours had allowed a hidden logic to surface. The indentation bearing the woman's half-formed name seemed to hum faintly beneath it, an unvoiced plea threading itself through the margins. I began tracing the cipher with my finger, stopping at irregular intervals to glance back at the 13th page of the Warwick Manuscript. There, nestled in the medieval script, was a short passage whose translation had bothered me from the first moment I'd seen it. The archivist had insisted on a straightforward reading, but I had known better. The phrasing carried a subtle imbalance, a small misdirection hinting that the surrounding text was not entirely what it claimed to be. The cipher echoed that imbalance. A repetition of symbols at curious intervals, a deliberate alignment of consonants. It reminded me suddenly of a crossword trick I had once encountered, a clue whose answer could be found only by reading diagonally across opposing entries. The thought arrived with such sudden clarity that I felt, absurdly, as if Staveley were standing beside me, guiding my gaze with a faint, weary patience. I tilted the notebook so the lamplight fell across the page at an angle. The letters that had seemed arbitrary now formed a pattern of diagonal strokes, mapping themselves against the medieval marginalia. And there it was, the connection Staveley had been circling, fearing, perhaps even protecting. The manuscript was not what Warwick believed it to be. Buried within the marginal cipher, hidden beneath centuries of scholarly reverence, was a confessional declaration from the long-dead scribe that the manuscript had been forged from older fragments, rearranged and embellished to appear whole. Warwick's proudest relic, the centerpiece of its academic identity, was a composite, a historical deceit stitched together by a scholar desperate for legacy. The archivist's reaction in the days prior suddenly sharpened in my memory. Her clipped defensiveness, her irritation whenever Staveley's name was mentioned. I recalled the gilt-edged pride she carried like armor. Her entire career had been built upon the manuscript's supposed authenticity. If Staveley had discovered its true nature, he had inadvertently threatened the foundation of her life's work. But discovery alone does not lead to death. fear does. I replayed in my mind the woman's account of her final conversation with Staveley, the relief in his eyes, the soft reconciliation of a man preparing to set something right. He had intended, perhaps, to reveal the truth gently, to protect those who might be hurt by it. And someone else had arrived after she left. Someone with access, someone who understood the stakes, someone who smoked. I paused, feeling the cold seep into my fingers. Tobacco, sharp, bitter, unmistakable, had lingered through the corridors long after Staveley's body was removed. The archivist had dismissed its presence as the bursar's habit, but she had been in the archive that night. She had keys, she had a motive, and she possessed the knowledge to understand precisely what Staveley had uncovered. The cipher, at last, had spoken. I closed the notebook gently, as though afraid the truth might scatter if handled without care. Outside the window, the wind moved through the courtyard trees with a soft, restless sigh, the kind of sound that feels almost human in its longing. Lewis would ask in his steady, practical way whether I was certain. Certainty, I would tell him, was a luxury. But the pattern has formed, and once a pattern forms, it rarely lies. The truth had been stitched into the margins all along, and Staveley had died because he had finally learned how to read it. Warwick looked strangely untouched by the day's unraveling when I returned for the final time. The dusk had begun its slow descent, that peculiar Oxford twilight which seems neither to arrive nor depart, but to linger in a suspended breath. The quadrangle held a faint amber glow, as though the stones themselves had absorbed the last traces of sunlight and were reluctant to let them go. I walked across slowly, feeling the quiet wrap itself around me with an intimacy that bordered on reproach. The archivist was waiting in her office, though she hadn't said she would be. She sat behind her desk with a stillness that suggested she had rehearsed the posture. When I stepped inside, she looked up with an expression that was neither defiant nor defeated, merely tired, in the way people become when they have held too tightly to a truth that was never theirs to keep. She asked whether it was really necessary. I told her necessity had very little to do with moments like these. Inevitability had done the work long before either of us arrived. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the framed certificate on the wall, the one celebrating her decades of service to Warwick's archives. I could almost hear the echo of pride she had once felt for it, the pride that had slowly fossilized into something else. She spoke quietly then, saying she had only wanted to protect the manuscript, protect the institution, protect the years she had given to its reputation. She said Staveley had pushed too hard, too quickly, without considering the damage the truth would inflict. She insisted she had not meant to harm him, that their argument had been brief, that his collapse had startled her as much as any accident could. But fear, she admitted, had rushed in before reason, fear of losing everything she had built from the fragments of other people's pasts. I listened without interruption. Guilt is rarely linear. It spills, shifts, doubles back on itself. She said she had found the torn page on the floor afterward and that she had removed it without knowing why it frightened her. The pieces aligned themselves with a steady, sorrowful inevitability. She had not planned anything. Yet intent becomes irrelevant the moment a human hand alters a scene already touched by death. When the silence between us grew too long to ignore, I told her she would need to come with me. Her nod was small, almost imperceptible, the gesture of someone who had finally stepped out of her own denial. As I led her through the dim corridor, her footsteps barely disturbed the air. A part of me wished she had fought harder, not for her innocence, but for the life she had spent so many years stitching together from manuscripts older than her own ambitions. Lewis met us in the courtyard. The dusk had deepened, and the first lamps flickered to life along the pathways. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, understanding more in that moment than words could have conveyed. The archivist paused once, just once, looking back at the library windows. In the fading light, Her face held a sorrow that seemed older than her years. After she was taken away, I remained in the quadrangle, feeling the last warmth of the day slip across my coat. Somewhere beyond the walls, voices drifted, students arguing, laughing, rehearsing their own unknowable futures. Warwick breathed around me with the ease of a place accustomed to burying secrets beneath its flagstones. I found myself thinking of Staveley, of his careful hands tracing margins, of the coded column he had struggled to decipher. I thought of his daughter, her quiet grief, her cautious dignity. I wondered whether she would ever forgive him for the years he had spent avoiding the truth that mattered most. The sky shifted again, the blue deepening toward night. A bell tolled from a nearby tower soft, measured, resigned. I murmured a line of poetry whose origin I could not place. Something about shadows growing loyal at dusk. The words felt right, even stripped of context. They lingered in the air, fading slowly, like the last remnants of a melody played for an audience that never realized it was listening. I stood there until the lamps brightened fully, until the quadrangle emptied of every sound except the whisper of wind threading through the cloisters. And in that hush, I understood what Staveley had tried to salvage. Not the manuscript, not the college, but the fragile hope that even flawed truths might still find their way to light. Warwick exhaled around me, and the day finally came to an end.